Interrupted. The father is in so much pain, his heart is being torn out. His daughter is dying. Interrupted. He saw Jesus, he fell down, collapsed before Jesus. He begged. She is dying. She is at the point of death. She may not make it. My little girl is leaving me. Interrupted. He begged, come, don't tarry, please hurry, come quickly. Interrupted. Please touch her, please place your hands on her, please heal her, please make her well, please let her live. Interrupted. Jesus sets out to help, but the crowds press around him. Jesus sets out to help, but he is stopped repeatedly with requests. Jesus sets out to help, but a woman waylays him. Interrupted. The story today from our scriptures is about being interrupted. Because Mark wants us to look at the world differently. To interrupt the ways we see it, the ways we experience the world, the ways we experience God. Mark wants Jesus to interrupt our ways of being. And so Jesus is interrupted in the story as we're to be interrupted. Jesus is interrupting our patterns of behavior. This section of the gospel about crossing back and forth between the boundaries, crossing over that lake to meet those outside what was considered the community. Yeah, I need the other one. Crossing over to invite people from outside the community to come in. Crossing over to share what it looks like to live in a different world and to touch people who are strangers, who are seen as enemies, who are seen as the unwanted and the unlovable, who are seen as beyond our path. And so that's why we have last week's story where Jesus interrupts our understanding of what the kingdom looks like by healing someone who's seen as so crazy that they have chained him up in a graveyard to keep him away from people. And so in this story, Jesus crosses back to our side of the lake, to the place where he is at home, where the people know him, they speak the same language, practice the same religion. And while he gets there, crowds begin to gather. And into that crowd, we're to ask the question, who is this? Who is this? Because I don't know if Joy preached on this, but one of the sayings in the first section of this part of Mark's gospel is Jesus is crossing the lake and there's a big storm, and the disciples at the end of the story say this: who is this that can make even the storm be quiet? Who is this that can even still nature? And so we're to ask that question as we work our way through this section of the gospel. Who is this? We first asked that and saw that Jesus is the one who confronts evil and transforms it into something that spreads the good news. Who is this? Jesus comes into this space with all the people in need of healing, and he heals. First, he's invited to heal a little girl. But he doesn't quite make it there, because on the way there are so many others in need. And as he's working his way towards that house with that little girl in need of him, a woman who's been worn down, who's been ill for 12 years. Catch this, she's been bleeding for 12 years. Imagine how tired she is. Imagine how worn out and beat up her body is. And it says within the text that she has visited all the physicians, asking for help with what is wrong. She has visited everyone who could possibly heal her. And no one has been able to fix it. And she's heard about Jesus, and so she thinks, if I but touch his cloak, I'll be made well. She's there in all her faith, in all her hope, in all her desire to be well, and she reaches out and just touches the hem of his cloak. And it says the power goes out of him. The power leaves Jesus in that moment, and the woman is made well. The bleeding stops immediately. And he says, "Who touched me?" And the disciples look at him like, "Are you crazy? Like, do you see the crowd around us? Everyone has touched you." But she knows he's speaking about her. And when he sees her, she tells the whole story. Not just "it was me, I touched the cloak." But she tells of her pain, of her suffering, of how long it's been since she felt good. And he says to her, "Your faith has made you well." And then some church people show up. And they say to the leader of the church, "It's too late. Your daughter's already gone. Don't bother the teacher anymore." And Jesus says to him, "Do not fear, only have faith." That's one of the ways Jesus wants to interrupt our stories. He wants to interrupt those points at which fear has overtaken us and we don't have enough faith to respond. He wants us to hold on to our faith and believe even when it seems impossible. He wants us to believe in the love of God, in the coming of the kingdom. He wants us to believe and have faith. And for Mark, because we hear the word immediately, faith is an action. It's what you do, not just what you say. And Jesus interrupts our patterns of fear. He interrupts those voices in our head that keep us from believing that all things are possible. He interrupts those voices that say nothing can change. He interrupts them and says, "Have faith. Do not fear, just believe." And they continue their journey to that house. And he takes his close ones, Peter and John and James, and they go into the room with that mother and father. And he lifts her up. He says, "Little girl, get up." And that girl who had been bedbound, who was fleeing this earth, is healed. Jesus interrupts what the people had set out. That there are only certain people that should talk to Jesus. And you don't need him now. Let the crowds have him. And besides, you're a church leader. You should know better. Like, faith healers can't do that kind of thing. But Jesus came to interrupt our understandings of who is important and who isn't important. And that's what this story is about, right? The first and the last. The least and the greatest. The first should have been the synagogue leader. The first should have been the important man. The first should have been his needs and wants. But Jesus looks and feels and experiences that hurt in the crowd, that hurt of the women, and says, your faith has made you well. He interrupts that dialogue that says that there are people that are more important and more worthy and more justified in what they get, and says, that woman, that little girl, are just as important as everyone else. He interrupts our understandings of what it means to be powerful and weak, what it means to experience the love of God. And that struck with me this week. Because I don't know about you, but how many of you have turned off the news since all the stuff has happened since the debate, right? The news has become so problematic because we look at one side and not the other. But what Jesus wants us to say is that both of those people aren't thinking about the kingdom of God. They aren't thinking about what's really important, the lives of people who are hurting. Now, I know y'all could argue over which one of them will be better, and I could give you my argument over which one would be better. But in the argument, we're worried about how old people are and how much people lie, and not thinking about real concrete lives. About how if you get cancer right now, you are likely to lose your house. We aren't talking about that. We're not talking about the fact that that hurricane came in July. Hurricanes usually come in September. Yes, it is hurricane season, but to have one that strong and that powerful at this time of year means that there's something wrong with the Earth's weather patterns and systems. And we're not talking about that. Jesus wants us to interrupt those discussions and talk about the least, the last, and the lost. Jesus wants us to interrupt those discussions that say certain people deserve and others don't. Because take Biden, for example, the one that some people may say is on our side. He's on the side of the middle class. But do you know who the majority of people are in the United States? Poor and low-wage workers. How does he speak to their lives and their needs and their concerns? How does he talk to what they need? And Jesus is saying, let us interrupt these systems of powerful men and say, look at what is important. There are real people in front of you that are hurting and need your help. There are real people in front of you that need health and wholeness. Jesus wants us to interrupt those systems. I often think about it this way. So how many of you get angry every time you see one of those environmental activists throw a can of soup at a painting? Because you're like, they're destroying a work of art, but they know that they're all protected, so the soup doesn't actually destroy the painting. Or how many of you have gotten upset when you've seen them interrupt Pete Buttigieg speaking, the energy secretary speaking, begging them to change their ways, to think about the environment? How many of you get upset when you see those young people confront a car full of elected officials telling them to change their minds about a war in Gaza? Jesus, like that first hymn, invites us to rage in the streets. Jesus invites us to confront power and transform it. Jesus invites us to interrupt the patterns that place some people above another and say everyone is important, everyone is welcome, Everyone is part of this kingdom of God, and our job is to work for everyone's benefit. Jesus interrupted our patterns. Interrupted. We are so tired of crying out. We're tired like that father of begging and pleading. We fear you are interrupted and will not make it in time. We fear that the wellness and life we are asking for won't be granted. Interrupted. Come to us in those moments of uncertainty. Come to us in those places of fear and grief and anxiety. Come to us and interrupt the scripts in our head and replace it with your comfort and love. Come, O Lord, come.